Welcome to docu-mental. I'm your host and producer of this video series, Healing the American States of Mind. My name is Whitney Fishburne. And on this, the third in the series, I'll be speaking with Timothy Nelson, the artistic director of the In-Series Opera Company here in Washington, D.C. And our topic is performing art as ritual and its role in a society as a perpetual way of healing. I hope you'll enjoy. Welcome, Tim Nelson.
I am very happy to be here, Whitney. Thanks for having me.
Oh, I'm delighted to have you. So the reason I asked you to be on, this is the third documental video, Healing the American States of Mind, is because I know through your work as an opera director, you have always had in mind the goal of creating art that is, I would say ritualistic, but I want to be careful using that word because it's not that it's codified, it's actually that you look for ways to use art so that a community can experience some sort of release, a catharsis of sorts. I'm going to put some links in the bottom that goes with this video to some of the reviews I've written and some of the other things about your shows. I've seen several of them. I would say my two favorite ones that I can speak to the way that they've been cathartic or gave a new way to look at a current problem would have been L'Enfance du Christ, which you staged as a participatory oratorial opera. I don't know. I mean, I don't remember what we called it, but it was.
Well, I think your phrase, I'm not sure what you call it. Your phraseology is best, I think, because I would think of it as a ritualization of the piece.
Yeah. And then your version of Carmen as a cabaret, which looked at the violence against women. So let's back up. So L'Enfance du Christ really examined the issues around immigration. And then a cabaret version of Carmen looked at the kind of seedy side of the opera that never really gets examined in the classical canon version of it. But what you did was you gave an opportunity to the community to not just participate in shows that they normally wouldn't even go to hear because it's so prohibitive to get tickets in terms of cost, but also, L'Enfance du Christ is rarely ever performed, actually.
Yeah, precisely.
Yeah, and then the other thing that you did was you gave people the opportunity to participate not just by viewing it and hearing it, but by moving within it. And so I was really blown away by those experiences because it was so immersive, and we don't go to the opera anymore and have it feel immersive. I don't want to be the one who talks to this whole thing, but I wanted to say one last thing. When I reviewed Tosca last season at the Washington National Opera, I had this sense, and I tried to allude to it in my review, that people were really excited because Ruth Bader Ginsburg was in the audience, as she often is, because she's an operaphile. But she had been called out by David Rubenstein, who's the chairman of the board of the opera of Kennedy Center. Yeah, Kennedy Center. And so people were kind of electrified, as they usually are when he points her out. More than once she's been pointed out, but maybe that was a gala. I don't know. But regardless, there was a lot going on around the politics of the day, as there is every day anymore. But I remember thinking, right as that tritone, bum, 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 the very opening of Tosca, I remember thinking everybody is here to focus and release at the same time. We were all focused on this drama of, troubled times, just like now. And I really did get the sense in being in the audience that there was this collective need to have this music wipe us out a little bit, clear us out, focus our attention on something that we all understood, regardless of our politics, but we understood the emotional tenor of it, the emotional tone of our beings were taught. They were, that's the way this city has been for so long now, since, 2016. Yeah. And then having everyone in that audience, I really did feel like this was an opportunity for us to all collectively in the dark experience something we needed to experience. Then I went to your performances and I thought, whoa, how much more powerful this is, because I can choose to be private with my emotional experience, or I can choose to participate and give of it and receive of it. And it was entirely my choice. Now, as a critic, as a reviewer, it's going to be a little different for me. But I was aware that that was what was happening around me. So I just wanted to let the audience know that these are the kinds of experiences one can have using performance in a community setting. But I wanted you to discuss your point of view on why opera is, or just the performing arts, so crucial for community to be able to knit together, to heal, and to be tight and strong for whatever it is they need to do.
Well, I think you're bringing up the Tosca is a really good jumping off place to have that conversation, because Tosca and Carmen are, of course, pieces deeply embedded in the canon. And for any work that's in the canon to resonate, I feel, especially the operatic canon, there needs to be a shock to the system, because the pieces are so ingrained in our collective memories that it's very easy for us to experience them comfortably. Even as is the case in Tosca or Carmen, they're actually dealing with very uncomfortable topics. It's easy for those pieces to become a sort of violence porn, because it's just to just passively watch torture in the case of Tosca, and of course deep misogyny and femicide in the case of Carmen. That particular Tosca kind of shows what I think we have a cultural reaction against right now, because it was a very beautiful production, and they used this sort of historic painted flats or drapes to create it, which is an incredible art form. The technique.
Oh, it was gorgeous.
But it's very two-dimensional, right? I mean, that's the whole point, is you're trying to create dimension out of something that's two-dimensional. So it gives a real distancing effect. And seeing a piece in a theater like the Opera House at the Kennedy Center, you're already very two-dimensional, because there's the proscenium, there's the audience, there's a clear division, never the two shall meet. And then in that production, that sort of accentuated that aspect. And what we're doing, and what we have the privilege to do because we work in the small, is to explore the power of the small, to indict and to make the audience an accomplice in these acts. Whether in L'Enfance, where the audience becomes accomplices in the act of migration, or in the other extent, where the audience became complicit in acts of violence because they were forced to sit there and laugh. The laughter wasn't just because we wanted it to be entertaining. The laughter was because we wanted the audience to be aware of their own complicity in the final death, which is an almost Brechtian sort of shock tool to make the audience think about what the piece is about, because it's so easy for us now to experience those pieces not as what they are about.
Well, let me stop you there, because that's interesting. You're saying accomplices instead of participants. I'm saying participant, but you're saying accomplice, which implicates us.
You would know, because you were in the audience as with new eyes, and I wasn't. But the intention was to make the audience realize that the audience was also part of the show. So they were also performers, because there was this dynamic relationship going on between the audience and the people on stage, and there really was no separation between on stage and off stage.
Right.
So that way, the audience, I think of the audience in that case as performers. So in that way, they are complicit.
But complicity, that's an interesting verb or word. Whether we use it in the transitive or the intransitive or the descriptive sense. But complicit. Either allowing, letting, or abetting, enjoying. So
in the case of that Carmen, I mean, there was so much laughter surrounding acts of the grotesque and acts of violence against all the characters, and homophobia, and the audience was we tried to get the audience to laugh at that, and then to realize that what they were laughing about.
What's interesting to me, though, is that if we're thinking about it in terms of, okay, let me amplify this out. My last video I did with 3 members of the Contraband Historical Society, one of whom is an ancestor of a contraband slave. the reason we had a discussion was to address the idea of reparations. And each of my videos kind of follow on to one from another. The first video in this series was with a pagan high priestess who said ritual and art help cleanse the spiritual pollution of a nation in order so that democracy can be pure and held in place. And she suggested reparations would be one way that we could clear the spiritual pollution, the miasma, using Greek tragedies such as the Aristeia as a touchstone for looking at how to release the bonds of karma, essentially, from wrongful sacrifice, from killing people and enslaving people and harming people for the sake of building for somebody else. And in our case, we've ended up with a patriarchal system that is hierarchical, and it's eventually, and as I've seen through doing docu-mental in the last 2 years, it will expend all of our resources and will end in tragedy regardless. But she suggested that reparations would be a way that we could clear that miasma. So I spoke with these folks about reparations, and my audience can go back and look at that video. But one of the things that came up as a topic was, I said, I don't believe that I'm racist, but I have been ignorant. And we discussed that. For white people who don't necessarily want to believe that they've been racist, fine, maybe that's true, but that doesn't relieve you of a responsibility for understanding, being empathetic of what has gone on, and then participating in changing it. And so when you talk about being complicit in the audience, it makes me wonder then in that sort of Oedipal sense where I didn't do the crime, but I still have to make up for it. And so when I'm complicit in laughing at something that, I mean, also, Tim, it was funny. The show was really entertaining. It was funny. And
then the audience becomes part of the momentum that drives the plot to its inevitable end. So in that way, complicit, in the way we're all part of a system that is driving the plot to the death of Black men.
That's what I'm getting at, because I really think it's important that you're using the word complicit, and I want to unpack that rather than just, oh, I was a participant and in the audience. That would be like me saying, well, I'm not racist, so it's not my problem. Okay, I'm not racist. In my eyes, I'm not racist, but it's still my problem. And I accept that. And that's what I think you're getting at here with your way of staging productions, is to let everyone safely understand their role in that and then magnified out in society. Do I have that correct?
Yeah, and I wouldn't necessarily always use the word safely. I mean, especially that Carmen, and that Carmen isn't a piece, it isn't an approach. I like the audience to be witnesses and to be participants. In that piece, they were, as you've illuminated, complicit, and that's not an experience I want to give my audience very often. It's difficult. I found that show really difficult to watch. I feel like to sit and watch it was to be complicit, and one should have wanted to flee the theater. And I didn't feel that was a safe experience. I didn't feel safe. I didn't want people to feel safe. And obviously, we're not talking about physical safety. We're talking about emotional safety and spiritual safety, because it's painful to realize you're spiritually complicit in acts of violence. But in that case, I felt that was the only way to talk about violence against women, particularly violence against trans women, in a way that wasn't pornographic.
I don't want to belabor it, but I do think there was a safety to it. I understand what you're saying, and it was tough to watch some of the scenes. And then, so the audience knows it wasn't pornographic, but it was violent. And it was violent in a way that you don't necessarily see in opera on stage, but you certainly could see in movies. But that's through special effects. This had to be done viscerally. These were people.
Yeah, and what made it disturbing wasn't. I mean, correct me if your experience was different, but wasn't so much that the violence was close or real, so much as it was enjoyed, and you as the audience were meant to laugh at it.
Right. Yeah. But the safety actually came from the fact that you yeah, I mean, you're right. It was disturbing, but I still think that there was a certain element of safety because, and this is why a ritual can, when you see things in art as ritual, it can be safe because it's contained, there's a beginning and an end, you're all there together, and you're all having an experience generated from the same thing. Now, y'all may react to it differently, but you're there together, and so there's a containment, and it's not out of control, but it can still move you to the same place. So some people were frightened by the protests, for example, that were downtown, and you're just around the corner from all of that. So, but there was this opportunity instead to feel and to know it was going to end, and I could go and I could sit with my emotions, and I wasn't going to have any harm befall me, but I had a lot to think about. And I think that there's a safety in that, and that's why I think it could be important as ritual because it gives you a way to contain something chaotic and violent and powerful without destroying you.
Yes, and in that sense, theater provides the context the same way ritual does. And I go with you that theater and ritual are the same thing, should be the same thing. For instance, there's a whole, and this is something I've always wanted to make a piece about, and maybe I will. There's a whole historical phenomenon that happens in the late 16th, early 17th century, particularly in Germany and Northern European countries, where women who were suffering from, and it became known as suicide by proxy, and women that were suffering from mental illness, depression and mental illness, wanted to end their life. But being strictly Catholic, felt like that wasn't an option given to them because then they would be sending their souls to eternal damnation. So the conclusion they drew was that they could kill someone else, go to the police, confess their crime, have time to confess to a priest, and then be put to death. But then the thought was that if they were killing somebody else whose soul was still in a state of sin, they'd be sending that person to eternal damnation. So instead, and there are literally hundreds and hundreds of these cases of women killing children who could still be in a state of innocence, going straight to the police, confessing their crime, being put to death, and having the chance to confess to a priest. And almost all these cases have the similarity in that the death, the murder itself became ritualized. So it was usually a neighbor child. They'd go to the woods. They'd spend the whole day playing with the child, praying with the child, all these different little rituals before committing the murder. And in that way, the ritual aspect was creating an emotional safety, I think, for them to understand and process what they were going to do, as horrible as it was.
Yikes.
It's an incredible phenomenon.
I mean, my mind is racing. I'm thinking, wow, I had heard of that and didn't know, I didn't expect that was what it was. I'd heard of it and I thought, it was just, I was thinking more along the lines of, like suicide bombing or something like that. But here's my thought on that I think is relevant to what we're talking about in terms of cleansing a community, is this idea that that was very calculated and it was about the self. So even though it's taking a child and all of that is morose, macabre, and so disturbing, it's self-focused. And I'm wondering if art, in the way that you perform it as ritual, gives us an opportunity then to create that ritual suicide that is metaphorical. You kill a piece of yourself. You kill the self you are, and then you come out different.
It all gets back to what you were saying earlier. And, the word catharsis wasn't originally applied to theater. It was a medical term. And then it was a spiritual term. And in the off years of the Olympics that we know, the athletic competitions, was a poetry, theater, and music competition. So our Winter Olympics were actually for poetry, music, and theater. And it was at Delphi. And the other thing that would happen there is a ritual washing of all of the soldiers in the Athenian army who had been in war and killed anyone. And they were ritually washed in blood to cleanse them of their sins. And that was called catharsis. And that's where the word originates from, which of course then has obvious ties to our Christian cosmology and the washing in blood and the cleansing through blood. it's all part of a really distinct lineage that starts with the Greeks and is very much present in all the way up to theater of the absurd and the theater we make now.
So that sort of depth of understanding about the history of art as ritual and community rituals that are not religious but are essential to the community in terms of they expect it to be performed, and makes me wonder if there is a certain kind of education that a community has to have in order for the ritual to be resonant. Do you think that's necessary, or do you think that we can be transformed regardless of whether or not we're grounded in the classics?
I think if the ritual experience is made well enough and thought is given to the language we use, that it is a common language or a language that can function on multiple levels, then definitely a wider community can get that cathartic experience from the work. I think education has become a really difficult word because it implies a top-down approach. It implies a patrimony. And I think we as theater makers are not doing our job if we aren't making our work function on a level that doesn't need extra work from the audience. Now, it might be ironic to hear me say that because my pieces are, I won't even say intentionally, but they're often made to comment on themselves and on the original. So the more you know about the context and the history of the piece, the more you'll get out of the piece.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
My hope, what I try to do is create pieces that the naive experience of the piece is powerful enough that people want to dig deeper. So instead of saying we need to educate our audience to understand this better, we prove to them that it's worth gaining that context, and we provide that context hopefully, and that over time and over layering of experiences they get that context, which I don't know is different than it might just be a different approach rather than a different side of work, but I don't like thinking of educating the audience to enjoy it as opposed to making the work sufficient in itself to encourage the audience to grow in their own understanding and to be empowered to understand it however they want to understand it.
Well, that's right. The empowerment is, I think, the key. It's like poetry, where people say, "What does it mean?" Well, you can say it means this, but so often it means that, and then it doesn't mean that. It means something else because it depends on who's reading it.
Poetry is that it is language used to get to the point past language, and it's the same about spiritual texts, isn't it? I mean, we all have an understanding of God within ourselves that is so much bigger than the text, and yet the text is at the access point.
That's an interesting way to look at art as well. You're saying we all have an understanding of God within ourselves. So then, maybe what you're saying is art. Are you saying that art is less accessible for people who are not? What am I trying to say? I mean, obviously atheists enjoy art, but is there more to be gained from art if you acknowledge that it's a spiritual vehicle? I don't know. Maybe this is just rhetorical.
That's one of the few black and white things for me. I feel inarguably, irrefutable, art is spiritual. The act of making art is entering into the liminal spiritual space. And when people are enjoying the art, they are having a spiritual experience, whether they want to call it that or not. It is a space that is beyond language, and for me, that's what the spiritual space is.
I'm going to just go on record to say I completely agree with you, and that the pieces, as a critic, the things that always appeal to me are the ones that bring me beyond myself, make me forget that I was there for even just a moment, which is why, my job as a critic is to also comment on the technicality and the execution of a piece, but so often I find that to be secondary, because if the performance is done well, all of that actually feels secondary because it's more about where they took you and where you end up. And that is a result of a person's skill, but that's the point, not.
Right, exactly. And you don't always need X to get Y. I mean, that's the mystery of
Yeah.
anything, actually, that you don't need, or as E. Cummings famously says he has a book of poetry called Is Five. And in the frontispiece to that, he talks about the mystery of poetry being that 2 + 2 can sometimes equal the title of this book. Like, and
Right.
that's the thing. You don't always need A to get to B.
So let's talk in general sense about your work and how you came to be. How did you come to be one of the few directors who'll speak very enthusiastically about the spirituality of art, and have you always thought that art was ritual and was um, an essential component of a healthy society? You haven't said those words to me, but I'm going to say that's what you think based on all the conversations we've had. So correct me if that's a.
No, you're right. I haven't always been able to articulate that. And I find our development as human beings is often like that. I realize now that I always felt this way, but I just didn't have the tools to explain or even in my own head articulate it that way. The alchemy that makes that is it's alchemy. It's mysterious. A lot of it is a lack of training. In that I didn't study direction. I didn't study theater. I don't have an MFA in theater. I made stuff, and I learned in making what worked for me and what didn't work. Part of it is being a composer, because part of being a composer is so focused on finding your voice. And so when that essential voiceness becomes part of making work without the training to make work, then the only thing you can rely on is your voice. So you don't know what not to know, and it allows you then to expand knowledge past the limits that we set. Part of it, as you know very well, is my relationship with the work and the man of Peter Sellers, who very much, if didn't inform those values, at least lent me a language to articulate them in. And the value of Peter is so much more than his work. The value of Peter is his words too. He expresses things in a language that provides a linguistic space for ideas you would have thought were inarticulable.
So what was the first show you mounted then where you started to understand your capacity to direct a community's attention or society's attention inward and externally at the same time?
So there was a process of building to it, but and there was always a sense of the ritual. Even in my first work, which was a production of Dido and Aeneas, there was already, and part of that is due to the text by Nahum Tate and the way the text ritualizes language, and Purcell ritualizes music through dance forms. So I cut my teeth there. So it started there. Then a couple of years later, I did a production of a 17th century opera by Charpentier called David and Jonathan. And it is an interesting work because it's in 5 acts, but it was written to be sort of combined with the spring musical, basically, at a French Jesuit college in 17th century Paris. So they performed 5 acts of a spoken play in Latin called Saul. And between these acts, they put 5 acts of an opera or a musical play called David and Jonathan. But because all the drama, all the narrative, the plot happened in the spoken plays, the musical play didn't have to do that. It could be a psychological exploration of each character. So when you took the spoken play out, what you were left with was a profoundly modern piece of theater that was about ritual exploration of love, sin, jealousy, these things. I didn't know that going into it. I just wanted to I loved the music, and I wanted to do a piece that was so openly homoerotic in its exploration of love and from the 17th century. But I realize now that taught me that plot isn't what drives the piece. Actually, it is the cathartic communal experience. And then the first piece I think that was intentionally capturing what you have described was my staging of Messiah, where I took a piece that was never meant to be staged, whose narrative is tangential at best, and is hinted at through borrowed troped texts, and all of these things now filter into all my work. I trope text all the time. That's how I like to work. And all that was learned in Messiah, which was a very intentional attempt to create a communal experience and not a story.
For those in my audience who are not operophiles and don't necessarily understand some of the more technical things we're talking about, what do you mean trope text?
Texts that are borrowed. So for instance, in Messiah, the texts come from all over the Bible. Some from Revelation, some from Isaiah, some from the New Testament, and Charles Jenkins, who put the text together, created a narrative by taking other texts and ordering them in a way that told a story different than what they were originally intended to do. And it's very similar to, again, Peter Sellers, for instance, when he has Dr. Atomic, the big aria, the text comes from John Adams' Batter My Heart, or in the new piece, Golden Girls of the West, the big aria for the baritone ex-slave who's escaped to California is Frederick Douglass's What the 4th of July Means for a Slave. It's sort of borrowing text and making them tell a larger story.
A mashup.
Yeah.
Mashup.
Which I've always found really useful. I mean, I wrote an opera a few years ago. I felt, and it was based on an Indian play, I didn't feel like I wanted to collaborate on the text. I didn't feel like I wanted new text. I wanted ancient texts. So to make it, I chose 3 Indian poets of different eras and took their text and crafted and welded it together into like a found piece of sculpture in the same way early 20th century modernists were doing.
And I love that about your work. But you even do that sometimes within the work. You did that with Carmen, with cabaret, making it into a cabaret. And that's why we've had this conversation before when people say, you're not being respectful. If a critic were to say to you, and it has happened, that you're not being respectful of the canon, you're saying everything is about the canon. Everything is about the piece. I am respecting the piece by really going deeper into the piece and finding out what else is there to be found with these pieces. And I think that that's actually, I'll infuse my own, I didn't say this in any of my reviews, but I have thought this, that in a way that's wisdom. You're gaining the wisdom that was meant to be there even beyond the composer of the piece. Back to that mystery again. And we go back. Why do we go back to the classics? Because they give us something every time. And what we gain ultimately is wisdom from it. We go back to it with our own life experience. But what is wisdom?
Nose on the head. Even the composer doesn't own that wisdom.
No. Once you let it go into the world, it's not yours anymore. And the wisdom component, the way I was thinking about what is wisdom, I'm getting older. So I was thinking, why do I think certain things than I didn't, whatever. So wisdom for me is you can look at something and you can deconstruct it, which is what you do with your pieces. You deconstruct them and then you put them back together. So what you do is when you take it apart, anything, an artwork, a theorem, a formula, whatever, you take it apart, you look at the pieces, and maybe you see it as a whole in a totally different way because you could examine each little piece on its own. And I think that's essential. And I was thinking about it in terms of what I'm doing with docu-mental. I am documenting our minds and what we think about things, but what I'm trying to do is deconstruct the things that we think so we can put them back together differently and then be different and be wiser. And I don't mean to be tooting my own horn, but that's really what I'm attempting. I'm trying to just be one voice looking artfully, wisely, and constructively at government. There is a poetry to what we do as we govern, and we never talk about that.
Yep.
And I think that's one of
the in this country.
Right, and I think that's why your work has always appealed to me. Because really, it seems like it's a way of saying, let's put the brakes on here. And you come up with things that most people have never, honestly, some of the things that you come up with, I go, I didn't even know that existed. And, like L'Enfance du Christ, I knew about, and there's that beautiful, there are these beautiful passages, especially towards the end, but, you only hear those in the classics, greatest hits collections and that sort of thing. I didn't really know the piece. So you'd also challenge me as a critic to make sure that I knew what I was hearing, and I had to go back and read, and, all. So it kept me on my toes, but there's also this need that you, I think, lead and fulfill, and I don't mean for this to be like a fangirl moment here, but we need it. And I think this is a good place for us to go into the next part of the conversation, which is how do we make what you do and what others could do or want to do or don't have the funding to do or have whatever, how do we make ritualized art in this moment in time in the United States where we are so broken, and how do we make it be a part of how we heal and go forward? Do you have any thoughts on that?
The first thing is to do what we do well. The thing we do has to justify that we do it. And that's been part of the motive behind the way I've approached how to make art during the new reality that we live in. That it's not how can I still make this, but how can I make something that justifies the making of anything. Like, we live in such a challenged time for myriad reasons, but including, of course, COVID and our confrontation with our own systemic racism, that if we're going to make anything, it has to justify its own existence, which to make entertainment now is vulgar. I mean, I feel. And I feel these studies that say people want to laugh. We get a lot in theater. There's a lot of studies as to what people want when they go back to the theater, and it's always coming up. They want to laugh, and I think people are misreading that as people want light, frothy comedy that will let them forget. And I don't think that's what they mean. I think laughter is the most obvious example of the physicalization of a real, deep, cathartic experience. I think what people want is to have experiences which matter. And then the other thing I think we do is not try to to replicate the thing we can't do. Like, there's value in the small, and the smallness isn't just a small theater. The smallness is me in my bed watching Netflix. And how can we as artists make that intimate experience also have depth of meaning? And not, there's so much talk about, like, how do we put a cocktail hour before it and a reception afterwards and let people chat during it. And we do some of that too, because people are longing for the social experience, but we shouldn't devalue the experience of solitude and the place one can go when they're in solitude, in deep solitude.
That's a really interesting point. I reviewed a performance last year of a vocal group who were exploring. It was a Libby Larson. They'd actually commissioned a piece by Libby Larson who used text language, like texting. And in a conversation I had with her, she was saying, we're not really sure where we're going with the American language yet. It's still kind of a work in progress, but it is very monosyllabic. And the point of the performance was that we're all so interconnected and alone at the same time. But I remember thinking in the performance, and I said this in my review, I felt like actually there was this revelation of, and we're not really comfortable being alone anyway. So there we are isolated, but we're not really sure what to do with ourselves when we're alone. And I thought that was actually a good takeaway from the performance, where particularly the younger generations that have been surrounded by the connection of things don't really know how to disconnect and then be whole. And again, this comes back to that wisdom concept. You have to deconstruct a bunch of things before you put them back together and see how they fit. And so we have to know ourselves as individuals. And I'm wondering if this is the opportunity as Americans to truly explore individualism in a way that is productive in the whole. But you have to really know who you are before you plug in. And I'm hoping this is an opportunity in our history to be less groupthink and be more participant as the individual in the group. So you have to know yourself before, rather than rent an identity from a brand or, a religion or a political slogan. Do you think art can help with that?
I mean, it already look at you and I. We're sitting here in Zoom, which 6 months ago I knew of, and it functioned as a business tool, a place for commerce and antisocial behavior. And now it is commonly, and this is an example of that, a space for having conversations about deep spiritual issues. It's a space for worship. It's a space for making art together. That's profound. I think it's profound that we are doing what artists do, which is make the world more spiritually verdant.
Spiritually whatted?
Verdant.
Oh, verdant. Yeah. Lush.
Yeah. Yeah. And we do it everywhere. And that includes now online.
So again, thinking about the future. So you've created the first is it the first digital opera house in the nation? It is definitely here in the region.
I mean, yes, it's hard to say what that means. Is the Met offering its previous recorded streaming content a virtual opera house? I mean, maybe. I don't think so, because they weren't creating content specifically for that space.
But that's the important part. You were ahead of the game and seeing, okay, old world gone, new world we don't know, let's help create it. And you have been commissioning works specifically for this medium and with dimensions that are for this medium and for the kinds of audiences we've been discussing, making it intimate one-on-one. So if I were sitting alone watching, it would be speaking directly to me in this way rather than just a recording of it. And that's not to diminish that there's power in watching, you know, a Met performance that's been recorded and I watch it. Although I will say, as an aside, I remember the very first time I went to one of the Met casts in a movie theater. It was Der Rosenkavalier with Fleming, and I remember that we got there late, and so we were sitting in the front, and I was looking up like this the whole time, and they looked like gods. And there was something really amazing. No, that was really amazing, and it was a totally different way to experience opera, because now they were huge. and you know, I have always said that opera singers are super freak humans anyway. I mean, the fact that they can do what they can do makes them superheroes. Truly superhumans. They are superhuman in what they can do. And so then
but that kind of gets to the point, Whitney, because like the Met, they didn't do it because of that.
Right.
Because of profit margins. And they've never pushed what you've just described as the reason you should go. And they've always pushed, this is a way to go to the Met without traveling to New York. But they haven't pushed that the experience is different and in a way better. And then they haven't used that knowledge to take advantage of that, to do something on the screen that they can't do live. And that's exactly the same thing. Like, if we're going to be on a small screen, how is the small screen and the intimate experience powerful? And then how can we make content that is designed for that experience and goes to the advantages and the apex of what that experience can be?
Well, so you went there. You went to where I wanted to go with this, which is the old world being dead means seems like it's an opportunity to actually retrieve art from the monetization mindset. And I wanted you to talk more about that. I mean, that quote that I sent you that I'll include in this in the show notes, but it was what you said to Anne Majette in an interview with her about the vulgarity. You already alluded to it here, but the vulgarity of opera, because it is so extreme in its elitism, and then tries to pretend that it isn't. Because, as I had said at the outset, you know, if you keep being extreme and you keep going to the hierarchical end, you'll run out of resources. And you've run out of people who can afford to come to your shows. So now what? So now you pretend that you're not that, but you're already fallen off the cliff because you've expended all the resources that you could have, and no one else has the resources to give you. So what do you think is going to happen to all the opera houses and all of the infrastructure that's been built around it? Where are we going with what we already have?
Well, I think more are going to survive than I wished would survive. But
that's frank.
I think there will be a profound shakeup. It's not going to be as profound as some people say, I don't think, or as profound as we hope it will be. But it could be the catalyst moving towards something. I mean, the problem with the model is that we want to be more accessible. We want to broaden our audience, which is great. We don't always acknowledge that it comes on the tails of our art form being constructed as a form of exclusion. It's at the very heart. It's like America saying now we cannot be racist without admitting that the structures of America are built on racism and the capitalist gain from oppression. Same thing with opera. I mean, we are an art form built to exclude. And we're not going to be able to move past that until we admit that. And part of that is the obsession with growth, with bigger and bigger and bigger. Mm-hmm. Big opera houses that are all about producing in a bigger way are inherently going to have a much harder time, if not an impossible time, reaching those inaccessible audiences, being accessible. And to go online, and of course we were the first, but we're not the only company going online, but to go online, which suddenly is smaller, but allowing you access to infinitely more people in infinitely more places, to do that and then to try to waste the opportunity by monetizing it, I think is sinful. I mean, I don't really have words for how obtuse that is. And one of the big problems with opera is that, and theater actually, and classical music in live performance, is that it insists on the audience having to be a guest in your house. So you're already asking people to come and be under you, to be your guest. And this instantly, in a moment, flips the table. All of a sudden, we as theater makers are coming humbly and asking people to allow us to be guests in their home.
Wow, that's a really great point.
Opportunity that the universe, through this plague, has given us, and to waste it by trying to do it the old way, I find really difficult and for me unconscionable.
Wow, interesting. So it's too soon. There's too much pain right now to say that there's an empowerment, and that people should be getting in touch with the empowerment of it. I think right now we really need to focus on making sure that we. I don't know. Actually, I'm thinking off the top of my head here. We obviously I'm thinking ahead in terms of what structures are we going to want to put in place when this is all done. But the people that you want to reach are people who are right now probably suffering in ways that hearing opera isn't going to help. I mean, there's an immediate crisis right now. What are we doing?
There is an immediate crisis. Part of that is spiritual, and part of that is the loss of hope, the loss of
That's the part that I worry about.
These are things that the arts are uniquely able to suture. These are wounds that we can do something. And, I really struggled with this after the lynching of George Floyd, because the last thing I wanted to do was make opera. And I'm blessed to have a really open staff that was willing to be in dialogue with me. And what I learned from them, and where I am now, is for better for worse, opera is what we do. Opera is, we make sound. That's what we do. And to whatever extent it can be helpful in this or any other crisis, it's our job, and I think it's the same for any profession, to say, what can I do and how can I do it better? And yeah, what I do is opera, but I do think that opera, there are places only opera can go. That's the reason I make it when there's not a crisis too, is because opera can start the conversations that are impossible or difficult otherwise, and go to a place that language or policy never can. And those are the places that, to whatever extent I'm able and we're able at InSeries, I want us to be focused on now, and not our own survival. Our own survival isn't important. But our survival does depend on mattering now.
Well, that's a key word, I think, is what matters. I keep going back and forth between what is the matter. Hi, what's up, buddy? What is the
matter? His own tail, I think.
Oh no. My dog's completely out.
I know, I'm jealous at the moment.
The idea that there's what matters versus what is the matter, and right now we're in what is the matter. We've come from what is material. It's all the base word. We've been materially obsessed, now there's a big matter. What's the matter? Well, everybody's trying to come at it and say, well, it's this. There's a lot of blaming going on to try and determine what is the matter, and through that we'll come to what matters. And to wrap up our conversation, I guess what I'm looking for then maybe is some practical ideas. You have the means, this is what you do. So you are creating sound, as you say, you're creating opera, you're creating anybody who wants to participate or be complicit or check out, just what it is that you do, will be able to. They'll be able to go online and they'll be able to see what you and I are talking about. You'll open your digital doors in September. Right?
Well, I mean, they opened last week. You can go on now and explore the different theater spaces we have, and an educational space and a live performance space, and we have different spaces on it. And it has content that was already existing that we filmed last year, and content that we've been filming since the pandemic started. That most of the latter is outreach or educational in nature. So it reflects still the old model of making opera in the theater and recording it. But it's a taste of what we do, and it's something that we can provide until September, when our first new content will start being released. But for us, it meant growing in the sense that now instead of 6 productions, we're doing, about 20 pieces of content. But that growth felt organic. It felt like this is what we need to do in this moment to be a good neighbor and to be a partner with the community in doing something, not growth for growth's sake.
So my last question then builds out of that is, okay, if you as the opera director and as the venue have had to quickly adapt, how do the artists of COVID-19 era and beyond have to prepare themselves to be conduits of spiritual delivery? You know what I'm saying? I mean, I guess that's what I
know exactly what you're saying. Part of what's been important in this process for myself and for us as a company, that I hope other people will allow themselves, is a certain element of grace towards ourselves and a comfort, being comforted in, and finding the comfort of not needing to know the answer to that question, being able to say, this is a year where we are doing something new, and just doing something new is valuable. And at the other end, we are going to know something, but we can't know now what it is. And that's okay. I'm going to make a lot of different types of things this year. Some of it isn't going to work. Some of it is going to work. At the end, we're going to still be together, and we're going to know more than we knew now. And those answers will come. And most likely the answer to your question, is not going to come from me. It's going to come from a younger generation. And a lot of my role, and increasingly my role as I age, but also as I become more institutional and less independent as an artist, is about just creating a space for a new generation to answer those questions, which will inevitably have to come from them.
That is such a really important but subtle point that you're saying is that, as you age and become more institutional, they're not because you're aging that you become more institutional, but you're doing both at the same time. I see in politics, this is what happens. For example, you have those who come in, such as yourself, with reformation in mind, revolution in mind. You see a new way to do things that will improve the situation, whatever the situation is. But the longer you're the one doing it, the more you are the incumbent. You are the institution. And there has to be, in that process, for things to stay vibrant and thus free and dynamic, there has to be that place where the incumbent can reinvent or step aside, and that's the expectation. And I don't think that that's what we're accustomed to, because in that sort of hierarchical view of things, there's always that, oh my God, I got to stay on top, I got to stay on top, I got to claw my way to the top. And if I don't stay on top or in power, I'm cut off from resources. And that is a threat to my survival. And I think undoing that instilled sense of fear of not being stuck into power and lodged into a place that is recognized keeps us from actually being regenerative and being free. That's what I think is the anathema to freedom. So as you're saying what you just said about yourself, it'll be interesting to see how you and others foster the new way of doing things and lead it and participate in it, but then also step back after you've been the leaders.
Yeah, I think I have a hard time not envisioning a system that's different than the one that you've very accurately laid out. But I want to believe, I do believe, I have faith. Faith is a good word for it. I have faith that that we have fooled ourselves into that dichotomy, that actually there is an abundance of there's an infinite abundance of space. And we fooled us to think that we have to conserve space, and if we let anyone else to the top, then there's less top for us to have.
Right.
One of the things this digital thing does is to a certain extent, blow a hole in that, because all of a sudden there's this huge amount of space that is open for other people to try new ideas. I think the problem isn't the guard getting old, because there are plenty of examples of an old guard that are still vibrant and dynamic. If we think, because of their wisdom and their experience, like Toni Morrison at the end of her life was still as vibrant as she was day one, more vibrant. It's a question of the guard, when it gets old, also taking up too much space and not providing space for other people. And I think the guard is still relevant at the top as long as they're using their wisdom to create more space. And certainly I still plan on making art when I'm at the oldest of the old guard, but I hope it's in a spirit of generosity and with an understanding of a vision of a world where there isn't limited space. Because art, of course, is working in the space of the spirit and the ideas, and those aren't limited. It's only a physical space that's limited. So hopefully we can reimagine a world in which that is felt intuitively and not just had to believed in faith.
In that way, art would be I would say at the point of the spear, the thin edge of the wedge kind of thing. But then again, that's still more linear. But art is an important point on the continuum in that case, because as you've already described, it's where it takes us beyond. It's that mystery, and so it's non-linear. And what you're describing is a matrix effect, I think, or just at least something that's not linear. What we've been talking about is the crumbling of that hierarchical linear way of thinking. And I think you're right that there is more out there, and we've just deluded ourselves into thinking that it has to be straight up and down. And I think what we're starting to see now is we were wrong. I don't know what that means. I don't know where we're going to go.
A necessary tension between the essential in what we do and in the spiritual and in the flesh, in the tangible of what we do, the resources. And that tension could be healthy, but right now it's very unhealthy, because we let the resources, that we let the tangible inform the spiritual, and it should be the other way around.
Yeah, I think yes, instead of being material, being instead more about what matters. And that same, but here's what we're dancing around. We were talking about deconstructing the patriarchy, pater, and really at the heart of the words we're talking about is mater. And maybe that's what it is this sort of, we're softening in order to be stronger. Because I think of mothers as softer.
Classic cosmological way of looking at it in any faith, yes, it is the feminine. It is seeking out the feminine.
I like leaving it there. Do you have anything else you want to add to the conversation?
No, this has been brilliant. Thank you. This is a great way to start my day.
Oh, good.
I'm fired up.
Well, it's always fun to talk to you, Timothy, and I am excited to see what comes out in September, and I will put more about what you're already doing, all the pieces that you've been, the Tehran. But why don't you tell us a little bit about it, and I'll put some stuff in the show notes.
Sure. I mean, again, it's actually, this ties in because there's a wonderful line from Rumi, which is that there is always a great mutual embrace between essence and accident. That one can never define what one does intentionally and what comes up organically. The two are a mystery. And we did this piece that ended last season, being 18-19, that took a Handel opera and the works of Rumi, and this is a Handel opera that was set in Persia of Handel's imagination, but we sort of tried to reappropriate the Persianness into the piece by using Rumi. And through that relationship came a great friendship with a woman named Fatima Keshvares, who is the head of Roshan Institute at University of Maryland and one of the world's great Rumi scholars. And she approached me saying that the Tehran Chamber Orchestra, or the chamber players of the Tehran Symphony, wanted to use the social isolation of this time as an opportunity to do a partnership with American artists, singers. And would I be open? And of course, immediately I thought, well, why don't we do the final moments of that opera with their symphony and our singers? So that's what the piece is. But the text, my translation of the Italian text is very much based on Paul's letter to the Corinthians. And all the spoken text is Rumi. So there's also this wonderful ecumenical dance going on between the mystical qualities of these two faiths.
Well, I'll put the link in the show notes. And I can't wait. It's going to be wonderful to see how the Digital Opera House leads us into something equal but not the same.
Yeah, and something which we don't know what it's going to be, and that's all right. It's an embracing of mystery.
Well, it's nice to have some mystery because everything has been so spelled out for us for so long. It's nice to think that there's some place left to go.
Yeah, there's a comfort in that.
Yeah. All right, Timothy,
well, thanks so much, Whitney. It's been a pleasure.
Likewise.